we saw in Judges chapter 17, we saw how this corruption of Israel now had really reached what we would call the sacred in the form of Micah and his mother, these carved images, these gods. And of course, we've seen different ones have gods in their homes before, which obviously was a violation of the first and second commandments. But Micah also had this ephod, and then this single Levite, this one who had been set apart to be a priest unto God and a mediator between Israel and Yahweh. This one who was to speak to Israel on God's words and to speak to God from Israel, and yet he was made Micah's own personal priest. He essentially had been sold or hired to be this role, and so he was a priest for hire, shall we say. We saw that while the Levites were not mentioned in the book of Judges before this, first mention is here where this particular Levite becomes a private hired priest. And so the corruption that we've seen throughout the book of Judges in the nation Israel and in the individual people that were leading Israel, that we call the judges, this corruption had, eventually, filtered down or gotten into even the Levitical priesthood. And so that's why we called the message last week part one of the sacred and profane. We have the sacred tribe that was set apart for God, and then we have it became profane. It became not what it was intended for. And so today we're going to see some of the repercussions of this, shall we say. This corruption really propagates to the tribe of Dan, or it's not necessarily so much propagating, but we see it kind of pop up again relative to the Levites. It's one of those chapters that we don't really see Yahweh, acting. We see references to him just as we did in chapter 17, but these references are very different from the references that we had, say, when we were going through the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Joshua, where Yahweh was the central character and Israel was, serving him or not serving him, but they were, being forced to make a decision. But he was the central character, and obviously it doesn't mean that Yahweh in Judges is not the central, one in control, the sovereign of all that is. Obviously he is, but he's not the central character in the nation Israel, in the life of the people. And so that's definitely a theme that we see. And of course it comes up in the, repeatedly throughout the book, and in the beginning of this chapter. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And that's not talking about God, that's just talking about there was no leadership. There was, previously they had Moses, he wasn't a king, but he was their leader. And they had Joshua, and he was their leader. He led them in to conquer the land. But in these days, there was no king in Israel. They had no leadership. They needed a leader. And ultimately, of course, we know that is pointing forward to Jesus himself, who will be the King of Kings. And so in those days, there was no king in Israel. And in those days, the tribe of the people of Dan, that was mentioned this morning during Sunday school, if you'll remember, the tribe of Dan. The tribe of the people of Dan was seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in. For until then, no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. This is kind of an interesting statement. If you'll remember, early in the book, or even in the book of Joshua, remember that was one of the things that we studied in the book of Joshua, was the allotment of land to the tribes. Now, I'm just going to pose the question, was Dan allotted land in the book of Joshua, or did God forget them? Was Dan allotted land in the book of Joshua? Well, the answer is yes, they were allotted land. God had set aside land for Dan, but then later on, and we see this during the book of Judges, that they basically forfeited their land because of these peoples that came in, and it was down in the southern part, down near Gaza, and of course we see the Philistines dwelling there, but Dan had basically forfeited their land, so they were living in these towns called Zorah and Eshtaol. Okay, and we're going to read of them just momentarily, but they were living in that area, but they didn't have a land. Why didn't they have a land? Because they didn't take the land that God had given to them. They didn't conquer the land and take it. And so here, at this point in time, from their perspective, for until then no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. So the people of Dan sent 5 able men from the whole number of their tribe, from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to explore it. Sounds a lot like when Moses, was ready to go into the land. And what did he do? They sent out the spies, remember? And of course, they came back, and 10 of them said, "We can't go in," blah, blah, blah. You remember all that. And so then they wandered around the wilderness for another 38 years, and then finally they went back, and Joshua, one of the spies that had said they could go in, became the leader to lead them in. So here we are, and they sent in spies to explore it. And they said to them, "Go and explore the land." And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. And when they were by the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. And they turned aside and said to him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here?" And he said to them, "This is how Micah dealt with me. He has hired me, and I have become his priest." Notice, he's not, God's priest. He's Micah's priest. Okay, I've become his priest. And they said to him, okay, so they're talking to this one that's a priest, a Levite. They said to him, "Inquire of God, please, that we may know whether the journey on which we are setting out will succeed." And so here we have this reference to apparently relying on God and making sure that what they're going to do is going to succeed. And the priest said to them, "Go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of the Lord." And now a lot of times in Scripture, we'll see something like this, and you'll see there's no note here that the priest actually went to God. But it doesn't mean that he didn't. We don't really know. But obviously the priest's interests were to Micah, because Micah was paying him. And he had basically sold himself to Micah, to work for Micah instead of working for the Lord. And so in his answer, we don't see any confirmation that God really did say that they would, that their journey is under the eye of the Lord. Of course, you could say, in a manner of speaking, all of our journeys are always under the eye of the Lord. We can be doing something God doesn't want us to do, and we're under his eye. Doesn't mean we're pleasing him. At any rate, I'm not saying that was the statement here that the priest was making, but there's no, even continuity between, are they really depending on God here, or is this just a formality? At any rate, so then the 5 men departed and came from Laish and saw the people who were there, or came to Laish, and saw the people who were there, how they lived in security after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth and possessing wealth, and how they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. So here there was this people, they were living in this place called Laish, and it was isolated. They were far away from anyone, and apparently the closest nation to them was the Sidonians. I don't know where I got the idea that these people were somehow part of the Sidonians, but were, living out away. Maybe some of us live out in the country a little ways, and, if we needed to go borrow sugar from our neighbor, we'd have to get in the car because we live that far away. But it'd be quite a walk, and we'd probably spill the sugar on the way back. And I just get the feeling they were living out like that. It was a town, it was a city, but they were out by themselves. Kind of, I think Fred was describing a farm that they had built and used to live on, and kind of like that, out and enjoyed the land, and it was peaceful, and there weren't, things going on with other people, and they could just, this was a blessing. And so the Danites here see this, these people living in Laish, and they think, this is kind of nice. They're wealthy. They don't lack anything. They have everything they need, and nothing. No one's bothering them, and not only is no one bothering them, but they're isolated. And because they're isolated, guess what? We can overtake them, and we can have this place. So, at any rate, they went out, they were looking for a place, and they saw this, Laish. And when they came to their brothers at Zorah and Eshtaol, so they went back to where they were from, or where they, the Danites were, their brothers said to them, "What do you report?" They said, "Arise and let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good." Doesn't that sound a little bit like what the two of the spies said when they came back and saw the land flowing with milk and honey? So kind of a little bit of that feel to it. It's very good. And will you do nothing? In other words, are you just going to sit here? Don't be slow to go to enter in and possess the land. Let's get going. Let's go and take this land. As soon as you go, you will come to an unsuspecting people. They're not expecting someone to come in and try to take them over. They're not, they don't have guards out. They're not protected by another people. No, they're an unsuspecting people. The land is spacious, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is in the earth. And so once again, we see this reference to God, but we don't see any indication that God gave them this land. God gave Dan a land, and they had refused it. They had forfeited it because their ancestors did not take over the land that God had given to them. And so now they're going out and they found this place, and they're just saying, for God has given it into your hands. It's like one of those things where we look at a situation, we say, well, I can do that. That means God gave it to me. These people are unsuspecting, and they're not well defended, and no one is there to interrupt from our taking over their city. And so that must mean God gave it to us. And so they're going to take the land. So 600 men of the tribe of Dan, armed with weapons of war, set out for Zorah and Eshtaol, and went up and encamped, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol. So they had gone back home, and now they're going up. And by the way, it turns out that Laish is really in the northern part of Israel. It's actually beyond the border, northern part of Israel. So they were in an area that God hadn't even given Israel. So they had gone back to southern Israel, where they were from, and now they were going back up, these 600 men, and camped at Kiriath Jearim in Judah. On this account, that place is called, in other words, this called Mahanadan to this day, this dwelling of Dan. Behold, it is west of Kiriath Jearim, and they passed on from there to the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. Okay. Then the 5 men who had gone to scout out the country of Laish, said to their brothers, Do you know that in this house there are an ephod and household gods, a carved image and a metal image? Now, when I read that, I'm first thinking, what are they saying? Are they saying we're not supposed to have those things? Is that what they're saying? We're not supposed to have a graven image or other gods? No, that's not what they were saying. What they go on and say, now therefore consider what you will do. And they turned aside there and came to the house of the young Levite at the home of Micah and asked him about his welfare. So let's just get the picture. The spies who had gone out saw these things in the house of Micah and of course saw the Levite, heard him. Remember, they recognized his voice, and so they went back home and they told the rest of the men, about this city. And so now they're going back, and the house of Micah is kind of like a little base there for them. They stay there with Micah and with the Levite. But while they're there, they say, hey, by the way, there's these valuable things here. Remember, Micah's mother had this graven image made out of the silver, the 200 shekels of silver. And so these were things of value. And so, here they are. They asked him about his welfare. Now the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate. You get the picture of maybe you've seen a movie where somebody's, carrying a gun, and they pull their coat back and show the gun. This is a kind of a threat. These 600 men are here, well armed at the gate. And the 5 men who had gone to scout out the land went up and entered and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, while the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with the weapons of war. And when these went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, the priest, the Levite, said to them, "What are you doing?" And they said to him, "Keep quiet. Put your hand on your mouth and come with us, and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be the priest to the house of one man, or to be the priest to a tribe and a clan in Israel?" And the priest's heart was glad. He already had sold himself to Micah, so what's going to stop him? He took the ephod and the household gods and the carved image and went along with the people. So he had already sold himself. There's more opportunity now. He's going to be elevated in his stature. Now he's got not just one man to be hired by, to be paid by, but all of this tribe of Dan. And so they turned and departed, putting the little ones and the livestock and the goods in front of them. And when they had gone a distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house were called out, and they overtook the people of Dan. And they shouted to the people of Dan, who turned around and said to Micah, "What is the matter with you that you come with such a company?" And he said, "You take my gods that I made, and the priest, my priest, and go away, and what have I left? How then do you ask me, what is the matter with you?" And the people of Dan said to him, "Do not let your voice be heard among us. We don't want to even hear your voice again." He says, "Lest angry fellows fall upon you." This veiled threat that's not so veiled, this show of force. We don't want to hear your voice, lest angry fellows fall upon you and you lose your life with the lives of your household. You think these things are important to you? How about your life? Is that important to you? Is the lives of your children and your wife, your family, are those important to you? Then the people of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his home. Pretty sad set of circumstances that come about. You might say, well, Micah gets what he deserves. That's, hardly the punchline here. Let's go on here. But the people of Dan took what Micah had made, and the priest who belonged to him. Such an odd statement to make about a priest. The priest who belonged to Micah. They took him. And they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword, and burned the city with fire, and there was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth-rehob, and they rebuilt the city and lived in it. And they named the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish at the first. And the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves. And now we have a great revelation. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. And so they set up Micah's carved image that he had made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. And thus ends chapter 18. But we see there who this Levite was. This Levite that went unnamed through chapter 17 and 18 until this last verse or two. He was Jonathan. He was the grandson of Moses. Remember that Moses and Aaron were of the tribe of Levi, and Moses really was the first priest. Aaron was really the first priest, and so here we have this tribe and this one Jonathan, the son of Moses. Don't you think that he should have known better? Grandson of Moses, excuse me. Don't you think that he should have known that his role was sacred? Well, leaving that alone for just a moment, if we zoom out just a little bit and look at the total of chapters 17 and 18 and try to find some commonality of what's going on here, there's one thing that jumps out at me about every character in these two chapters. And I would say Yahweh is not a character in these two chapters. He's alluded to, but I think that it's a false trust. It's a false statement of allegiance. They're not committed to God. He's just their rabbit's foot, let's say. He's the one that they rely on for good luck. But if we zoom out again and we look at everyone from Micah and his mother, this Levite who turns out to be the grandson of Moses, and the entire tribe of Dan, what jumps out at me is their utter selfishness. It's not your everyday selfishness like the toy truck is mine. I'm going to take my pail and shovel and go home, or my ball and bat, whatever it is. Or the last donut is mine. That we call that selfish. And yes, that's a pattern of selfishness that we try to teach our kids when they're young not to have. But that's not the kind of selfishness we're talking. This is a selfishness that permeates their entire conduct, their entire life. You could say that their whole life, their living is in the realm of this selfishness. It's all about me. We have this son who steals from his mother. And then the mother who has made this curse, and she's afraid of what's going to happen to her son, so at least she has a little bit of value there. But what does she do? She keeps most of the gold, the silver, the 1,100 shekels, but she takes 200 of it, and what does she do with it? She has some graven images made for her son. And then Micah goes and he purchases a priest. He hires this priest. Of course, the priest is willing to be purchased. He sells himself to Micah for, pay. So we see selfishness there. He's going to serve Micah, really, instead of serving Yahweh. We see this repeated reference to his priest. It was Micah's. And then, of course, we see the tribe of Dan. They're going and looking for a place to live. And yet God had given them a place to live, but they didn't take it. They didn't do what God wanted. They were overtaken. They were driven to these cities where they lived, but it wasn't their land. They were not living and occupying their land. And so here they are. They want land to live in. So they go to this people who were unsuspecting, occupying this city of Laish. Unsuspecting, unprotected. And they take it over by the edge of the sword. Of course, we also see they took the priest and the gods and the graven image and from Micah, and they said, we're stronger than you. They essentially said, go away or we'll kill you. But they didn't say it in those words, but that's basically what they were saying. If you study the Bible from Genesis through Judges, and we did go through Deuteronomy and Joshua, but we've been through, you've all studied them before, those early books of the Bible. One thing that is strikingly missing, certainly from chapters 17 and 18 here, but even from the book of Judges at large, is Yahweh. Oh, he's mentioned, I know, from time to time, but at least in both of these chapters, the mentions of God are to make sure that he will bless me, remember Micah. And to make sure that our conquest will be successful in this tribe of Dan. And even the priesthood. We have this idea of priesthood that we know comes from Yahweh, this mediating between God and man. But here it's perverted. It's corrupted of what the priesthood was supposed to be. The focus of these characters in this episode, if you will, in these chapters, are all about me. The things they did, from Micah stealing from his mother all the way through, the Danites taking the city by the edge of the sword, they were all driven by, motivated by this utter and complete selfishness. Even the corruption of the priesthood was completely driven by selfishness. The priest said, I can get a good wage by being hired by Micah. And things are even better if I go with the Danites. Of course, part of that was probably fear too. But if we could take this selfishness that we see in these chapters and trace it back, we would find ourselves back in Exodus chapter 20, thou shalt have no other gods before me or beside me. That's where we would end up. We would end up right back there at the law that God gave to Moses. And really, honestly, we could go back even further, and we could go right back to the creation and the 7 days of creation, and what was the seventh day. I say 7 days, 6 days of creation, but what was the seventh day? It was a day of rest. And what was the rest about? It was really about worshiping God. It wasn't just about not doing work. It wasn't a do's and don'ts kind of thing. It was a don't allow the normal, regular, I'll say profane things of life to interfere with our worship of God. Set those things aside for one day and only focus on him and recognize, where we get our blessings from, starting with the blessing of life. Now, these Israelites here had lost the reference of God and of Yahweh and what he meant. Long since lost that. They just didn't have a frame of reference with Yahweh. And in fact, we saw even how the Israelites, the phrase changed from that they did evil in the sight of the Lord to that there was no king in Israel and every man did what was right in his own eyes. We saw that shift, that change of reference. They no longer had this reference point of what God wanted. They weren't even concerned about that. Now it was just about whatever we want to do, we do. And why do I say we can go back to that point in time, that commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, and see that is the root of how we got to where we're at? Well, it's because we don't want to get there. We don't want to get to where these people are. And yet, we have to understand, how did they get there? It's because they didn't obey the first commandment. I've quoted this quote over and over again, and I'll quote it more in the future. You can bank on it. It's not a quote from the Bible, but we see this pattern from the Bible, but the quote is very simple and short. Life is a series of small decisions. And what that means is that we don't wake up one morning and decide to forsake God. No, we choose to put our needs, or really desires, above other things, maybe above our family. And that creeps into putting our desires above God and what he wants us to do. And ultimately, eventually, that replaces him with these other gods. And those other gods include ourselves. See, the first commandment is not primarily about worshiping statues or some deity. It's about ultimate allegiance to Yahweh. When Micah and the Levite and the Danites prioritized their own needs and desires above God, they've already violated the first commandment. They violated it in their heart when their priorities were wrong. And that worked its way out by the choices they made. The idol is merely the symptom. The disease is that they've enthroned themselves as their own gods. No one wakes up and decides to abandon God wholesale. Instead, we make 1,000 small choices. Comfort over obedience. Convenience over conviction. Our vision over God's promise. Each decision might seem reasonable in isolation. Micah wanted security for his household. The Danites wanted a better territory. Those things don't necessarily add up to a bad thing, but cumulatively, as they make the choices that they make because of those things, they constitute a complete inversion of the first commandment. You've chosen yourself as your God. So what does this mean to us? Well, I hope that the application is abundantly clear to us already. What are those little areas of life where we are choosing to deviate slightly from God's purpose, maybe for our own convenience, for our own comfort. See, those are the little areas where this begins, where that rotten apple just gets a little spot on it. I say the apple gets a little spot on it and becomes rotten. And pretty soon what happens to the whole bushel? Obviously, it's all rotten. Or as Paul said it in Galatians 5:9, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. This is the way sin is, the way corruption is. And it starts in this little area where I want something convenient, and so I shortcut God. And it spreads like a cancer. It metastasizes. Well, I'm just going to read a few verses, quite a few verses, to maybe bring this home. And I'm not trying to meddle, but maybe God is with us all, myself included. Jesus said, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." And really, money there is just like a placeholder. It's really anything else. It's really another way of saying, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Because if you have a God before me, guess what? You're not really devoted to me. You're not really going to obey me. Because there's going to be this competition between these two things, and you're going to have to make choices, and that's where we get into trouble, instead of choosing to obey him and keeping it simple. Remember, Jesus said, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." So the question isn't about the do's and don'ts of life. It's really about, do we fundamentally love Jesus? Is he at the core of my reason for living, or my living at all? Verse we quoted during Sunday school, "Set your minds or your affections on things above, not on things on the earth." Ultimately, if our affections are on something, that's the thing that's going to motivate us. That's the thing that's going to govern our decisions. So Jesus, or Paul actually says that to the Colossians, "Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth." In Proverbs we read, "Keep your heart," or "guard your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life." Out of our heart come the issues of life. We make our decisions by what's in our heart. We're going back to where is the root. Of course, Paul, when he was in Acts chapter 17, you'll remember he was on Mars Hill, and he was speaking to the men of Athens, the Athenians, and he was trying to persuade them, or to open their minds to the idea that there's one God. And so they had all these gods, and so he's referring to, let me open up the actual passage here. He says about God, he's talking about God making everything. He made everyone, every man of every nation of mankind, to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries for their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him. In other words, obviously that's not the way salvation works, but he's talking to men who aren't saved. He says, God owns all of it, created all of this. Yet he is actually not far from us, for in him we live and move and have our being. And that's the question. Are we living and moving in him and having our being? Are we depending on him? We talked about Job this morning and how Job needed to depend on God. And in the midst of this trial that is unfathomable to us, and we can think, we've been through losing a loved one, like Job lost loved ones. And yet the things that Job had gone through, and maybe we should study Job, but we're not going to do it next. My wife has persuaded me that we need to go to the New Testament after this book, but at any rate, maybe we'll go and study Job together. But we see Job in this circumstance, and in the end, he ends up questioning God. And honestly, I don't think there's anything theologically wrong with questioning God as long as we are willing to stand around and hear the answer. In fact, if we're not willing to question God, then maybe we're blind to reality. There are difficult questions that have to be answered. We have to wrestle with these things. But God is talking to Job in Job chapter 12, and he's talking about all of the beasts that he had made, and all of that. And he says, who among all these beasts, these created things, does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. He is the way, the truth, and the life. We have life itself from him. This is where Paul gets that. In him we have our life and breath and see if I can quote it correctly. We live and move and have our being. That's the scripture that Paul is drawing that from when God was talking to Job. And then, of course, we can see kind of the other side of the coin. We can go to the book of Daniel, and we can see that Daniel, after Nebuchadnezzar had died, and there was his son, King Belteshazzar, and he had a dream, and they called Daniel to answer the dream, and in the process, the king's promising him all these things. He said, I'll give you a purple robe and blah, 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 these riches and things, and Daniel says, and you are his son, Belteshazzar, have not humbled your heart. You're Nebuchadnezzar's son, and you haven't humbled your heart, though you knew all this. You knew about your father. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you. You and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine for them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways you have not honored. Is this recognition. In him we live and move and have our being, but if we don't recognize that, then we're like Belteshazzar. And we're valuing those riches, those things, more than we're valuing the life that God gave us. We're not honoring him with our life. All of this, remember, is these Israelites that were living with this, idea of the priesthood and of mentioning God only in the context of this selfishness, and they had forgotten. They were living and being and, breathing and moving within God's, with God's very permission. That God had given them life and not only given them life, but given them land and given them this nation and called them and made them his very own, and they had forgotten all that. And they got away from all that. And they were just living in this selfishness. The writer of Hebrews says, for it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, we know that to be Jesus, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. Jesus was perfected in the suffering that he went through for us. For he sanctifies for he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. Who is sanctified? In the New Testament, when we read about sanctification, who are we reading about? We're reading about us. We've been first saved and being sanctified. We're being set apart. What is sanctified? What does set apart mean? It's the same idea of holy. We are holy. We are sacred. We are sanctified. We are set apart. Which brings us to what Paul said in Corinthians, a couple of places, in a couple of different contexts. Do you not know that you are God's temple? What is a temple? A temple is where God would come and dwell and meet with us. We are his temple. The temple had to be a pure place, a sacred place. It could not be corrupted. They had to go through the ceremonial washing, the high priest, before they could even go in, or they would die. It had to be sacred, set apart, it had to be clean. We are the temple. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy. There's that word, set apart, and you are that temple. And then a few chapters later he says, or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. This whole thing is realizing that all of our life is not only purchased by him, but we are his. We have the life we have because of him. Our whole life should be about him, not about us. It's the exact inversion of what we see in Judges 17 and 18. We'll close with the reading of one last verse, two verses, out of John chapter 15, verses 4 and 5. Jesus says, abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Yesterday was Valentine's Day, and I was fortunate enough to find some roses in Walmart to bring home for Dawn. They were picked through, but they were pretty nice. It'll be about a week or maybe two, and those roses, well, I should say the roses are already dead. They're cut from the vine. But they'll look dead in a week or two because they don't have, even though we can put them in water and we can put the little, food in there, packet of food in there to kind of give them a little bit of sustenance after a while. But those roses are doomed. They are dead. They will look dead and will fall apart, and we'll have to clean them up or throw them away first. They're temporary. They're a beautiful symbol of love for a little while. But they're dead. They're cut. In him we live and move and have our being. If we're cut, we don't have being with him. We don't have life. We're just dead. We need to remember as Christians that we have our being in him. He is our everything. He is our purpose. He is the one we depend on for life, for sanctification, and salvation. And if we don't remember that, then before too long we'll be living out Judges 17 and 18. We will have inverted. We may be using his name. We may be coming to this place. By the way, this place in itself is not holy. It becomes holy because we're here, because we're holy. We're set apart. That's why this place is set apart. There's nothing special about this place, but wherever we go, we carry his image. And we make holy wherever we go if we understand whose we are. We don't want to lose that or forfeit that the way the tribe of Dan forfeited God's promises. We want to live this out the way Israel should have been living. Well, let's close in a word of prayer together.